And I want to start off by talking about walls. The great thing about Donald Trump is he just gives you material. And so one of the big things that he started off was, we're going to build this wall. We're going to keep those Mexicans out. He didn't do his homework because in 1994, they started building their wall. I mean, he's 20 years out of date. And this wall they continue to build it. The first phase of it was 14 miles, including about 300 meters into the ocean, just south of San Diego. The interesting thing is that walls haven't been that successful in keeping people out. And so you have people who would gather together at the wall, and families on either side would come and they would hug and they would pass food and money back and forth, and not quite sure what else. But the wall was very popular for people who needed to see their families. And so in spite of trying to keep them out. But then came along, let's see if I got the other picture, which one? So this wall has been continued, they've been building it, and now it's into Texas. They've gone through California and Arizona and parts of New Mexico, and so there's bits and pieces, but you can see, like, it's just stretching across. It's the ugliest looking thing. I mean, at least get some paint and make it look nice or something. But I don't know if anybody heard, but on the weekend, this thing went viral because some people were there at the wall, and they were got their camera out, and they were recording because the Mexicans had brought ladders, and they were climbing over the wall, and the guards, the American guards, were just down a little bit, and they were watching what happens, and so the people actually said, "So why aren't you stopping them from going over the wall?" I said, "Well, we have a method here. We have to report to our office that people are climbing over the wall, so we can get support workers, other guards to come. Otherwise, it'd be too dangerous." And the people said, "Yes, but we've been timing it. It takes them 20 seconds to climb over the wall." And the guards nodded. And the people were pouring over the wall, and the guards watched, and the system didn't work. Because walls do not keep people out. So we live in a city, and I love Toronto, and Toronto's an incredible city, but we have walls. And it's not just the walls of Rosedale. It's not just the walls of the Bridle Path, not just the walls of King and Bay, but we also have other walls that separate us. And there are the walls of racism, and there are walls of economics, and there are walls of education, and there are walls of age, and there are walls of ethnicity and culture that we put up, and we think that we're going to keep people out. But it doesn't work. There was a community in Atlanta, Georgia, about 20 years ago, and they wanted to build this big gated community for the rich. And they not only built it gated, but they put barricades across the road so people couldn't get in, and armed security guards with semi-automatic weapons to keep anybody else out of the community. And then when the people moved in, they found out that they couldn't get people to come and babysit their children, or to maintain their pools, or their lawns, or to cook their meals. In fact, when they first opened it, the Atlantic Transit Authority wanted to run a bus route through it, and the people had said, no, this is too private a community. And then they went back to the Atlantic Transit Authority and said, "Would you please run a bus through our community so that our workers can get a kid in and provide the support that we need?" Walls just don't work. So, and I use this because reconciliation is about the tearing down of walls. The walls do come crumbling or tumbling down, depending on which song you like. So if we can just move on. So reconciliation is a word that we don't use that often, but it does get used. Finance understands it because they talk about reconciling the books, not cooking the books, reconciling the books, making sure that the black and the red add up and come together. In politics and in war, we talk about it as negotiating to bring about peace. We talk about it in marriage. In fact, the number one reason that why people get divorced is because they call it, the term is irreconcilable differences. We can't get together. And it's also a way that we describe our state of mind when one finally gives into the difficult state of affairs that they find their life in. And so this is oftentimes the ways that we use this term, reconciliation. We want to look at it first from a biblical perspective. Now, the Old Testament, if you haven't caught on by now, Old Testament isn't like the New Testament in the sense that you can go to the New Testament, you can look up Paul, and you can find the theology around the incarnation or around reconciliation, whatever. The Old Testament, you go and you look for stories because that's how they taught their theology, their understanding of God. And so you take, for instance, there in Genesis, and so you have the story of Abraham and Isaac, and then Isaac has two sons, twins, Jacob and Esau. Esau is the older. Esau is the manly man. He's the hunter. Interesting, I don't know if anybody noticed, he's also a redhead, so I don't know how the Irish got in there, but they're part of the story. And Jacob is the chef, the cook, the stay-at-home mama's boy, but he's also conniving, and not once but twice cheats his brother out of his inheritance, his birthright. Got to understand that the older son, even if there's only minutes older, gets 80% of the father's wealth, and everything else, the other 20% is divided up amongst the other children. And so Jacob saw the opportunity. That by the second time he fooled his brother, realized, oops, I went a little bit too far. His brother ticked off. His mother says, you better head up to Syria to my family, where it's going to be safe for you while your brother cools off. It took 20 years for his brother to cool down. And you guys have family, you understand that. And meantime, he got married twice and had a couple extra concubines and had 12 sons. Came back 20 years later with all his flocks and his sheep and his goats and his cattle and his donkeys and his camels, because that's how you had wealth back in those days. And that was the expression of it. And he finds out that on his way back that his brother is coming to meet him. Isn't this good news? Except that he's coming with 400 horsemen. Or maybe they're on camels. And his brother is a local warlord. And he realizes who he's dealing with. And that maybe the welcome isn't the welcome he was hoping for. And so what does he do? He gets down on his knees and he starts praying. And I mean, he gets down on his knees and he's praying. He's saying, God, you got to help me. And I think he's thinking about his brother. He's going, no, God, I'm really serious. You really got to help me. And he's going, 400 horsemen. God, you got to hear my prayers, because there is no future for me or for my family or for my... And so he devises this method. He says, I'm going to send him gifts. And I'm going to send him cattle, and I'm going to send him sheep and goats. And then I'm going to send Leah's family, because he loved Rachel more. You've got to understand the mind of this guy. And then he sends Rachel, and then he goes, and he bows down 7 times before his brother. And his brother reaches out and grabs him and hugs him and weeps. Esau is the victim in the story. It's important for you to remember that part. Esau is the victim. And Esau made a way of reconciliation. Well, one of those 12 sons was Joseph. And what a messed up family. Because you have the story of Joseph and his brothers are so jealous of him, and probably rightly so because of the way Joseph was. You know the story. They first talk about killing him, and then they sell him off as a slave. He ends up in Egypt, ends up in prison, ends up in front of the Pharaoh, and ends up second in command of the most militarily strongest country in the world of their known time. And he's second in command. And a famine hits all the land, and beyond all the Middle East is hit, including Canaan, where his brothers and fathers are. They come down. Again, he messes with their head for a little bit. I guess it's a little bit of revenge. I don't know how you want to interpret that. It's up to you. Second time they come back to get more food, and they're having he puts on a banquet, a private banquet for them. And he realizes all the emotion, all the connection, all that needs to take place. And he's been building up for this moment. And imagine after spending all that time, what is he going to do with his brothers? And what is he going to say to them? And how is he going to respond? And he gets up enough courage, enough in his voice to tell everybody to leave the room except for him and his brothers. And then it says, he wailed. He wailed so loudly that everybody in the house heard him, and it says everybody in the city heard him. You ever wail? When you're wailing, you can't get words out. So imagine those brothers don't know who he is. They just know he's the second most powerful man in the universe. And he's crying before them. And I imagine they're terrified. And finally, he gets out the words, I'm Joseph. Reconciliation takes place. That's the theology. That's how we learn theology from the Old Testament, from hearing those stories. Again, Joseph was the victim, and Joseph reached out to his brothers and welcomed them back and tore down the walls of separation between them. So the New Testament has this word that appears 11 times, the word reconciliation. And it's a compound word. It starts with allo, which means other, and then you add alasso, which then changes it or alters it in exchange for. And then you add kata, which means either against or concerning. And then when you boil it down, it simply means for reconciliation. Or you can put it this way. It's concerning the other in its most literal understanding. And a couple times they add on another one, apo, kata alasso, and that just reinforces it. That it really is about the other person. It means you give up all your rights. It means that you may be seeking after justice, but you know what? The only thing that's really important is the relationship. That the relationship, or as Jesus said, loving one's neighbor, trumps everything else. And are you willing to expose yourself to more hurt and risk your position so that you can be right with someone who has perpetrated hurt and pain to you? And we have the story of Jesus. He who had equality with God gave up that position. And there in the Gospels we read John the Baptist sees him coming and declares, "Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." And for those 3 or 4 years of his ministry, as he lives out reconciliation, as he begins to tear down walls. Remember the story of Jairus' daughter? Jairus is a leader. And Jairus is the leader's daughter is ill. But on the way to the house, the unclean woman, who's a pariah in society, who's pushed aside, Jesus takes a moment and spends to hear her story. Tears down the walls. Reconciliation. Jesus goes up to the north to get away from the crowds. And the Syrophoenician woman comes to him, healing for her daughter. And he brings healing to a doubly outsider person. And he brings reconciliation to the centurion's slave and brings healing. And all throughout, he targets people. He has these divine appointments. So Matthew, Zacchaeus, outsiders, People who the rest of society had put a wall up against and said, you can't be part of us. The lepers, those who were the unclean sick, who were not allowed into the presence of people. Jesus tore down those walls. And at his death, the veil was torn in two in the temple. The veil that hid God from everybody was torn in two. The wall came tumbling down. The Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. God, in a sense, became the victim because everything that we do, remember David declares, against you and you only have I sinned. You may have sinned against other people here and there, but every time you sin against God. And so God has become the victim. And God makes the way possible for reconciliation. God says, I want to have a relationship with you. And I want to have it so much that I will pay the price so that we can have that relationship. And God makes it possible. The walls come tumbling down. And so we have this teaching there. And it says there that when you look at the three key passages for us, Ephesians, I'm probably a little bit, I didn't even get to this. And this is the one that talks about the wall coming down, but it's through the blood of Christ. Now, in our conservative theology, we talk about the blood of Christ cleanses us from all sin. And we take that very personally. But when you get on to the other two passages, the one in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 18, that God is reconciling the world to himself. And again, when you get into Colossians, it's not just the world, it's all of creation, everything in heaven and beyond. It is about the universe. There's a guy by the name of Teilhard de Chardin, and he was a theologian, an engineer, and scientist, and he wrote a book, and he called it back in 45, 50, called The Cosmic Christ. And he says, you know what? Your God is too small. If you think of salvation and reconciliation, if it's just about you and God, it's about the whole universe. And God has a much, much bigger picture than you could possibly ever imagine in your finite being and mind. That God is about reconciling the whole universe, and it all started with Christ shedding his blood on the cross. And so when we talk out here about at Yonge Street Mission, about tearing down walls, it's not just about what we do regarding the spiritual side of the ministry that we do. But that passage, and again, I'm probably way off my slides already, but the passage that talks about that God is reconciling the world to himself, and he calls us to join in the ministry of reconciliation. And that's verse 18, and then verse 19, and then verse 20 says, and so you are ambassadors for Christ. And the ambassador, the message you're bringing is a message of reconciliation in whatever group that we are called to come and serve. But we too need to start with our own reconciliation, that we need to be reconciled with God. We need to have this experience of this transformation that is continually happening within us as we reconcile our relationship, as we discover our own spirituality. We should skip that slide. You guys can read that part in the paper. Really good stuff, but we need to move on. A couple more slides down, just so I know where I am here. It's the Palestinian wall. Again, another crazy idea where they 700 kilometers. Like that's almost from here to Quebec City. In length across the country. But you can see it's not very successful. Banksy went to the wall, and he said, This is every graffiti artist's dream. This is paradise. We have 780 kilometers of wall. And so he did 9 murals. Interesting, because he went and he had a guide. And he asked the guide, is it okay if I put a ladder up against the wall? And the guide said, you can do what you like. And while he was painting, the guard was laughing. And he said, what are you laughing? He says, up in the towers, they've been watching you with a gun aimed at you the whole time you've been painting. But I love this one because children are playing in the sand with their sand pails, and there's a hole in the wall that he's painted, and on the other side is a beautiful beach. Reconciliation. The walls come tumbling down. But our ministry, the ministry that we're called to. So Angie was talking about our donors, and volunteers were talking about groups coming in. Many of those groups are from businesses. I mean, why are those groups coming to Yonge Street Mission? Did you know that the banks actually have a statement in their donation, in their charitable givings policies that says that they do not give to sectarian organizations? I don't know if you know what a sectarian organization is, but you work for one. Just so you know. And yet, the building next door to us has a big sign that says TD Securities Computer Literacy Lab. There's reconciliation happening. We are agents or ambassadors for Christ. That we can tell them, you know what, Christians actually can do good things. And we can learn to work with each other. And that you have good things to give, and we have good things to give. And why don't we come together in that synergy that comes together when groups from differing backgrounds come together, when the walls have been removed, and the synergy begins to make Toronto a better place for all the citizens to live in. That's our ministry of reconciliation. So back in the fall, we had some new staff members who are not part of this group of staff, and they were working with Lindsay. And so they wanted to get some of the orientation that we provide, and she said, Bill, can you come and can you teach them the theology of the mission? And I said, I don't know. Are they ready for it? And she said back to me, is Yonge Street Mission ready for it? And so I had the chance to go and spend 4 different mornings with the women working through our theology. And some crazy stories that came out of it, especially the last one when we were trying to talk about the Trinity. But I don't know, they transformed me. They made me think far beyond, no offense to any of you, than any of you have pushed me on the issue of the Trinity. We had an amazing dialogue. And now I've got 6 other friends that back in September I didn't know their names. And I think that they see the same thing, because the walls have come tumbling down. We are being transformed ourselves, and the community that we share with, that we minister to each and every day, is being transformed. Matthew's put together a great song, and so we're going to play it this time. I mean, we got amazing staff who just asked them to do something, and sure, I'll write a song. So here it is.
See the walls come down. See the walls come tumbling down. We stand as one, it is our mission to be ambassadors of peace with no division. Proclaim the gospel to the poor, freedom for the captive, sight for the blind, and set the oppressed free. See the walls come
of the Berlin Wall.
See the walls come tumbling down. See the walls come down. See the walls come tumbling down. The temple veil is torn in two. Thank you for the cross. God is reconciled to me and you. The door is open now for all to enter. Jesus, our cornerstone, dwelling at the center. See the walls come down. See the walls come tumbling down. See the walls come down. See the walls come tumbling down.